Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Patient Access Strategies to Drive Sustained Brand Growth, presented by Phil. I'm Rebecca Cushmiter. I'll be moderating the webinar. I'd like to start by introducing today's speakers. We'll be joined by Daniel Johnson, Director of Product Marketing at Phil, and Patrick Coyle, the founder and CEO of Novus Proximus, LLC. You can read their full bios on the left side of your screen by selecting the Speakers tab. Just a few notes before you begin. To access additional resources for today's presentation, you can click the Handouts tab button on the left side of your screen. You can access closed captions from the bottom right corner of the video player. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be available to watch on demand within 24 hours. We'd love to hear from you during the presentation. Please submit any questions you have to the Questions and Answers tab on the left side of your screen. Time permitting, we will have a Q&A session, and we will address questions during the presentation as well. Okay, now let's begin. Daniel, please go ahead.
Thanks so much. Welcome, everybody. We're really excited for all of you to join us here today, with what promises to be a very rich discussion, where hopefully you will take away some practical strategies that you can bring to your organization as you look to improve patient access to drive brand growth. Before we get in, I'd like to just give a little bit of an overview about Phil, and I'm going to ask my counterpart, Patrick Coyle, to do the same to provide a bit more of an introduction and overview of Novus Proximus. So Phil is a patient access platform. We combine best-in-class stakeholder engagement, digital hub services, a national dispense network, real-time data, and proactive access insights to drive brand growth, and a full-scale wholesale distribution solution, all of which is designed to help brands unlock coverage, drive patient adoption, and optimize their overall gross to net. Patrick, if you wouldn't mind, it'd be great if you could just give the audience a little bit more about your background and Novus Proximus.
Yeah, thank you, Dan, and thank you all for your time today. It's really a pleasure to be here. Novus Proximus is a business advisory firm focused on the life science industry, really bridging the gap between commercial and finance. And my background is in finance, largely, most recently CFO over at ASI North America, but roles of progressing importance in finance. But it always brought me into the business side, and looking for the value to be created in the gaps in between. And I think patient access is one that fits squarely in the middle, as we'll talk about today.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Patrick. So let's dive right in. So to set up the conversation today, we wanted to have a little bit of a brief discussion on the current state of patient access. So most life sciences commercial teams today are really looking for ways to enhance their channel strategy. They've been frustrated by the existing options that they have from a channel go-to-market standpoint, because they see that many existing channels today stymie patient access, or at the very least don't optimize patient access. So they look to the brand and they're at their brand, and they see challenges with things like speed to therapy, or a gap between formulary placement and the actual covered dispenses that they're seeing in the pharmacy, or even limited visibility into the prescription journey, which leads them to conclude that, I need to shake up my channel strategy. I need to do something different, and that a alternative channel strategy is a option that should be strongly considered. So you've come to the right place today, if that's where you're at. And I want to start off by asking Patrick, both in your role at Novus Proximus, advising life sciences brands, and throughout your career at a variety of organizations, throughout the life sciences industry, you've really worked to help brands think about unlocking patient access to drive brand growth. So, what do you see today in the environment, Patrick? And what do you hear from brands that are coming to you at Novus Proximus looking for your guidance?
Yeah, thank you. I think there's extreme financial um, duress on the channel. I think whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act coming, or and how to model for that, or whether it's your gross to net and the space between not well understood. Life science companies from very early on are focused where they should be on innovation, and getting through the clinical, getting through the clinical trials and preparing for launch. I think the thing that is less on their radar is what is changing, or has changed in the ecosystem out there that could be a barrier to a patient having the optimal outcome, which is the intention of every company at that stage, right? I think a lot of the larger organizations have figured out how to prioritize the patient journey relative to the larger macro environment. But I think as you're preparing for launch, it's changing quite a bit.
Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective, Patrick. The external environment is definitely something that is in flux today. I think from our perspective at Phil, particularly since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've definitely seen a rapid change in consumer expectations and patient expectations, to really demand a different type of experience and a more seamless, frictionless experience, one that they've been become accustomed to in the other industries that they engage with, and that pharma really, I think, until had made progress certainly prior to COVID, but has put the foot on the gas. I think in many ways, brand teams and patient services teams to respond to this rapidly evolving consumer behavior and deliver more responsive experience. One thing maybe, Patrick, may be great for you to touch on is particularly in the specialty space, as we see biosimilars coming to market, is the challenge of brands face and their therapy being dispensed as intended.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think when it comes to bioequivalence, and generic medicine, and whether you have the same formulation, it's not the same result, right? Often, and I think from a payer perspective, they're able to apply controls on the system, but it's really about how do you get the product to be dispensed as written, as intended, um, in a system that is trying to create every headwind to drive barriers to access to your branded product, especially where there's another option available. And I think there's high rebates to overcome, and other operational barriers. But to your talk about the discussion about COVID and what it's created is an opportunity to advance technologically, but it's not unilaterally. So there's a lot of operations that have come up and taken advantage of technology in the pharmacy space, and there's some that haven't, and it's a very disparate experience. And I had, just myself, two prescriptions written yesterday for my daughter. One had a generic alternative, one was a specialty medicine, and where they were going to come from and how I was going to access them, what was going to be the copay, were they covered under my benefits. You know the system, having been in it, and how to manage through that. But the majority of people do not have that benefit. So those barriers to access are real. Some of them are geographical, some of them are operational, and technology helps, but not if it's not if it's not deployed.
Yeah, Totally agree. Really good perspective. Let's transition to how we see um, or how brands to a discussion of how brands can think about um, taking a more rigorous and structured approach to addressing some of these issues and structuring their patient services programs, their patient support programs, access programs, whatever you want to call them, in a more rigorous way that does right by patients and makes the um, access to the therapy more seamless, but then also ensures that the brand can continue to sustainably invest in patient access and also invest in reaching more patients and more prescribers. So when we think about the building blocks for success of patient support services programs here at Phil, we think about this framework at the highest level. So the three things that we think need to be true to orchestrate a effective patient services program that is going to ensure timely, affordable access to therapy, and then sustainable brand growth are an effective copay program and strong business rule design around that program, a dispense network and channel strategy that provides a consistent patient experience and ensures that the highest percentage of patients are eligible to be able to get their prescription covered by insurance so that they can afford and adhere to that prescription in the long run. And then finally, because of the fact that the environment is constantly in flux. Payers are changing their formularies and their benefits designs year over year. Brands really need to be thinking in a data driven way to optimize these programs. So, let me just touch on the first one and then I'll kick it to Patrick. So, from a copay and business rule design standpoint, our perspective is that one, it certainly needs to be structured in such a way to optimize the brand's goals and help patients afford therapy. But other things that really need to be considered that I think some brands miss when it comes to copay and business rule design is structuring it in such a way to incentivize a preferred network. So if a brand is going to market with an alternative channel strategy, utilizing a hub or another access partner, typically the goal should be to get as many scripts as possible through that preferred channel that provides the best chance at coverage, best experience, and best economics for the brand. The other thing that I think is pretty common in the marketplace, particularly at launch, but then can extend, after that launch phase, is that the uncovered offer gets overutilized, right? When really a copay program should be designed to buy time for coverage when it comes to that uncovered offering, so that patients can get started on therapy, but then in the background, that benefits verification or prior authorization is being pursued. So those are some thoughts there. And Patrick, I'd love for you to touch on, how you think brands should be thinking about structuring their dispense networks and why that's really important.
Yeah, and I think as you're thinking of launching or relaunching from a market access perspective, it's always about the distribution channel. How can you get your product out there in as many hands as possible to be utilized appropriately with the right messaging and follow up and education? I think what happens is the reality of the real world sometimes comes back much later through market research or good or bad experiences. And so it's very important to first understand the ecosystem of the end dispensing pharmacy, whether it's affiliated with ecosystems in integrated delivery networks, whether they're going to be standalone specialty pharmacies, high specialization pharmacies, or they're going to be PBM, contracted pharmacies and or retail. So understanding that is usually pretty easy from a planning perspective, but the differentiation of all of those kind of segments with any individual pharmacy is very, very different. So when you're structuring your copay and designing the business rules, it's very important to understand what your access looks like from a payer perspective today and what it's going to look like tomorrow. And you have to know who the competition is that you're up against and likely contracting against. And we also have to know who's coming down the line. And it's perfectly murky, and carve outs and individual copays that are not specified clearly in contracting makes it very hard to do that. And like you said, a lot of times it results in pharmacies processing OCC3s uncovered, and and then the rest is history. So I think it's very important to understand: what is your strategy as an organization? What are you contracting for, and is it fit that strategy? And then in the execution, are you getting the results that you expect? For higher preferred tier status and formulary positioning, is it translating to average copay benefit spend declining, or do you see the opposite because there's a lot of other programs out there, back to the hurdles, like accumulator maximizer programs that are going against what you're trying to accomplish? And at the end of the day, for manufacturers, it's about getting the right medicine to the right patient at the right time. And there's a lot working against that isn't always visible to the public, and especially patients. And the last thing you want patients to be worried about, sometimes there's obviously worse disease states than others, but you don't want patients having to worry about a horrible experience in trying to get your try to initiate therapy and then stay on therapy, right? To make sure that you have the best durable responses and above clinical outcomes in the real world. And that's just so every experience from every patient is going to be very different depending on where they're acquiring your product. And so I think it's very important for folks to really understand how that copay fits into all these other moving pieces, and then to say, okay, everyone that is going to receive this therapy is going to have a different experience. How do we create a homogeneous approach to that from a distribution channel perspective and an execution?
Yeah, really, really great insight, Patrick. And I think that that complexity that you're hitting on segues to my next question. Why is it so challenging for brands to get this right? Why do you see this as such a big challenge? And there may be something to touch on there from a data standpoint as well.
Yeah, and I think it all comes at the end of the day. There's a lot of connectivity back to finance and contracting and getting what you pay for. And I think availability of data has got to be key to look at and cross that bridge back to the financial statements and based on what's in the forecast. But at the same time, the data is going to inform you of what that experience looks like. From a longitudinal de-identified patient perspective, as they can go in and out of various parts of the channel, that's got to be maintained, and so that you can look for clues to where that journey is disparate, right? And at the end of the day, a patient, right? Remembering that a patient's on the other side of that. When you're building out this thing for launch for organizations, a lot of times you have a data group that's not necessarily connected to the access group, that's not connected to the finance group, and so all of these things move forward at different speeds, and it's got to be well orchestrated. If you're lucky, it's in one place, but like we're talking about, patient support, patient services isn't usually in one clean place. There's firewalls for good reasons in organizations, But at the end of the day, it's very important for the whole organization to be successful, for the patient to have the best outcomes, which is what is good for society, and the reason that we're all in this business. So I think the data availability has got to be key, but it's not just data. It's got to be clean data. It's got to be well-structured data. It's got to be data that fits within the matrix in a back to a homogenized way. And then it's got to be able to draw insights into what's going on and then how to improve it for the better outcomes.
Great. Yeah, that's those are all really important call outs, Patrick. And I think that the inherent complexity in thinking about delivering a really effective access program and additional patient services offering often lends brands to make the decision to say, this is something that we are likely better served by not trying to do totally internally, and that we really should be thinking about a access partner or a series of partners, call it an access ecosystem, that can help us reach our goals and deliver that patient-centric experience that is sustainable and help us continue to reach more patients. So we wanted to share with you some of the characteristics that we believe are critical when organizations are thinking about developing a patient services program and selecting a potential partner. And Patrick, I think you were just hitting on it pretty significantly on the last slide, that it really should start with the patient. Everything that a potential partner is going to provide from an experience standpoint should be patient centric and should be focused on making sure that the patient has minimal barriers to be able to access therapy, start on therapy, afford therapy, and continue to adhere to therapy. The other one that we didn't, necessarily touch on as much on the last slide, but I think it's a critical component for brands to be thinking about, particularly as the ecosystem has become more and more rigorous from a HCP requirement standpoint, with things like prior authorization requirements, step edit requirements, appeals, etc. The HCP experience is a really big thing that a brand should be considering when evaluating potential network partners. And from our standpoint, there is a very wide range of infrastructure investment and approaches on the marketplace that potential network partners employ. And brands really need to be questioning potential partners on the outcomes that their partners are able to deliver on things like PA requirements. Is this partner successful at supporting HCPs and being able to facilitate successful submissions? What does that number look like? Out of the PAs that get initiated, if they all get initiated by the partner, how many actually get submitted and get sent to the plan? There's very few brands that are launching today and that are in market today that don't face PA requirements. Another one, certainly from a consideration standpoint, is plan contract coverage. So if you're thinking about building a dispense network and having an alternative channel that is going to dispense medications for you outside of the retail channel, there's some really big differences there. Whether the pharmacy is using mail order formats or retail formats has a very significant impact on the number of plans that they're able to contract with. Most mail order models typically are not able to contract with many regional, local, and state brands. So something that brands should really be considering when evaluating a network partner. The pharmacy format, kind of just hit on that, mail order versus retail versus specialty. Definitely some really distinct differences there that brands need to dig into. PA outcomes, can't stress enough. And then, very important thing I think to hit on here is the quality of insights. The data is certainly one thing, as Patrick was just touching on. But if that data can't be translated into actionable insights that the brand can go ahead and apply to altering their copay structure or altering their dispense workflows to respond to PA behavior, then that data is really not valuable data for the brand. Patrick, is there anything else that you think brands should be thinking about when evaluating potential network partners?
Yeah, I think it's their level of technology. Back to what we were talking about earlier. Patients expect faster responses, better communication. Uh, Prescribers have less time than ever to spend with those patients and rely on the outcomes being what they expect. And I think when you're just talking about the HCP experience, we touched a lot on the patient experience. In a perfect world, the education is there, and the awareness is high, and then the your product is used as intended. Um, and then the share evolves to be as high as it can to help the most amount of patients. You assume in a perfect world you plan for all of that to go well, and there's a lot of focus on that, because lack of awareness will kill a brand too. But you don't necessarily always plan for a bad experience due to an operational execution, right? So, for instance, there's a lot of pharmacies out there we talked about. Each one of them has a completely different and changing by the minute level of capability from a technology perspective, and a willingness to execute. Time is money, and everybody is spending time that they don't have, and they have less patience, pun intended, than ever, because I think we've been used to getting served things faster and timelier. So for brands, you have to consider that as time to execution in the channel. If I've seen horrible experiences with oncology products where there's a delay in initiation of therapy, or there's significant adverse events impacting that patient journey very early on. That is known in clinical trials, and you have to make sure you account for those things when it's obviously more critical than ever in some disease states that we talked about. But it's important for every patient on every therapy. So when you're choosing partners, you have to look at what are those capabilities, and how are you going to, again, go back to monitoring data that comes in, and keep grounded by best patient outcomes. And like we talked about earlier, I think the payers, whether it's in biosimilars or whether they're generics or whether it's just a highly competitive disease state with not a lot of clinical differentiation, those are all challenges. There's all kinds of prior authorizations, utilization management being exerted all the time. And those systems and capabilities of those organizations are evolving. So it's a constant struggle to say, how can we be in perfect concert to make sure, again, patients get what they're supposed, the medicine that they're prescribed for, and at a lowest cost possible for those patients. Really, really critical. And this is good for all of society, right?
Yep, couldn't agree more. Thanks for that, Patrick. And I think it's pretty fair, and what we're suggesting is that all teams in a life sciences organization on the commercial side of business truly have a stake in shaping and promoting patient access, because it really is the reason for being for life sciences organizations, is to get the therapy that a patient needs in their hands at the right time. However, and I'm sure you've seen this in your career, Patrick, spanning a number of life sciences organizations, and we've seen this at Phil as well in programs that we've managed, in that incentives, understanding of the various variables that influence patient access, and focus across teams can really vary. So let's dig a little deeper into how organizations can make patient access a north star, and get all of the commercial teams, the brand teams, the access teams, field teams, trade and distribution, focused on the same goal of maximizing patient access, ensuring that patients have the lowest out-of-pocket costs, can get the medication they need in a very timely manner. And that obviously often involves promoting the alternative channel, be it the hub, or a pharmacy network, or a specific pharmacy. So, how do you think organizations can better align teams to do that, Patrick?
Well, one of the challenges that I've seen in my career and working across big, middle, little pharma, emerging, and mature, and across almost 10 therapeutic areas, is every therapeutic area is different. And almost every product is in a different stage of the journey relative to the disease state. And I think so. Just within an organization, as you evolve through multiple therapeutic areas, it gets extremely challenging because there are some similarities and commonalities, but there's many that are different. So I think just as organizations mature in their portfolio, it gets very complicated. But I think through all of here is information, and technology plays a heavy part of this. The capabilities of an organization from a technology integration is really key. You need to have data strategy of what are we acquiring, in what structure is the architecture, and what are we using that data to inform? How are we pulling it together, leveraging APIs? Are we, who's on premise and who's in the cloud, in the SaaS environment? These things are constantly in flux, and some of the best providers don't necessarily have the best technology. So you have to really understand the gaps in between. Bringing together cross-functional teams early is a huge part of this, because what I've found is all these different groups have different interests, right? They all have the organization's interests in mind, but they don't necessarily have each other's interests in mind. So it has to be a very open, collaborative process that you constantly ground the organization and who you're helping, right? Because it's also very easy to go back and say, this is a job, I'm doing my job. But there's a patient at the end of the day that if these things don't work well together, the handoffs are going to drop and a patient is going to suffer. And then the mission from day one of that organization fails at that point. So I think it's good to get everybody together as early as possible, whether it's a company launch or whether it's a brand launch, and just say, what is our expectations? What are we seeing in the clinical environment that's going to inform potentially the real world environment? And then what other external factors are going to change, that clinical experience? And I think it's very important to understand and get as many people together as possible.
Yeah, I think that's really critical. Something that we really strive to do at Phil when we're launching a program, or even prior to a program launch, is to really engage multiple stakeholders in the process, and really educate them on how our platform, how our channel can, one, of course, improve outcomes for patients, but then also, how does it benefit them? How does it help you reach your goals from a market access standpoint? How can we help you convert that hard-earned formulary placement and or inform your market access strategy with our data if it's a launch brand or if it's a sales team, commercial teams, even having those conversations around how do you structure your incentives or your go-to-market strategy to make sure that the team is effectively promoting the preferred channel, which obviously in the cases where Phil is managing a program as a digital hub, that's Phil, and making sure that the sales team understands the benefits from a new patient start standpoint and an adherence standpoint of scripts that flow through the Phil channel, so that they are invested in the process, invested in the program, and are ready to promote the program to their core constituents, which are obviously HCPs. So I think that segues into something that we wanted to provide that I think is a practical way to think about a lot of challenge, a big challenge that many organizations have when promoting an alternative channel, and that's driving preferred channel adoption. Patrick, I can't speak to your experience, but be curious to hear it. I've certainly engaged with a number of manufacturers that share that they can only get single digits patients to engage in their preferred channel, 5%, 10%, and that often leads them to feel pretty frustrated because of the work that goes into setting up an alternative channel, the investment in an alternative channel, and it's a missed opportunity because most organizations know that the alternative channel is the best channel for patients because it's usually the one that provides the lowest out-of-pocket costs, the highest coverage, and the best long-term outcomes. What's your experience been like with that, Patrick, as you've been engaging with brands and talking about patient access strategy?
Yeah, I think too often it's one strategy for an organization. Well, for let's say for a brand or a therapeutic area, yet alone if it's a multi therapeutic area, it's even harder. But I think there's always one strategy, overarching strategy, and I think there's there's there needs to be more willingness, and I think that's where we spend a lot of time in showing there's alternative approaches. I think there you don't have to be all in on one thing or another when it comes to distribution and channel strategy. So I think whether it's a hub, an e-hub, or leveraging technology to the fullest when it comes to designing alternatives, it's very important. You can do pilots and see what kind of patient experience is better, what the data will show you in one channel strategy versus another. And then you start to look at leveraging costs because, like I talked about at the beginning, the burden is on the manufacturer with high rebates, high cost of R&D that's often overlooked when we're doing pricing for new products. There's a tremendous amount of R&D and innovation goes in there, and then everyone else is trying to take away from that return on the clinical investment, because at the end of the day, these manufacturers have to answer to shareholders. And so I think having an alternative strategy, looking at profitability of that strategy, looking at data generation, looking at patient experience, will often yield very different results. So I think it's about having different options and not being married to one way. It comes down to flexibility and willingness to pivot in a timely manner, because usually by the time there's a problem with a patient journey, a patient experience, or part of the channel, the HCP's heard about it and are likely, that's going to be a problem for the brand. And it's always harder to make a second impression, after the first one's been, had a bad experience.
Yeah, for sure. No, really, really good to call out. And, I think like calling out the fact that, having, multiple options, whether that's a digital hub in retail or whatever that may be, um, can often make sense, and it really should start with that patient population and the competitive dynamics of the brand and the HCP population that you're targeting as well. But having those multiple options, as well as making sure that you're maximizing choice and options for patients, so that each individual patient has multiple options and can access the one that makes the most sense for them, I think is really important to call out. And I also like that you called out that brands should be thinking about being creative and testing new channels and new strategies with pilots and measuring the effectiveness of these channels against the current way that they are going to market. So really good things to
Yeah,
call out.
I
Yeah, go
think,
ahead,
yeah,
Patrick.
Dan, there's a good question. I think that reminds me, a lot of organizations measure success by of market access, of good broad, uh, quote unquote open coverage, right? And I
Right.
think
Yep.
therein lies the devil of the details, because you
Mhm.
can be not you can not have an NDC block, but that doesn't
Mhm.
guarantee that you're going to have the results from a pull through perspective. So it's very important to understand the caveats as an organization. What type of headwinds are you going to face, and what kind of tailwinds, and how do you position yourself from an access perspective relative to the competition, but then see it actually pulled through in the real world. So um, yeah, I like to start to move toward other analytics to then just broad coverage as a percentage of the business that's available as open. I think you need to look at what kind of formulary tier do you have specifically, what kind of copay
Mhm.
do you have, what kind of deductible are you being hit with for the product, what is the OCC8 fully covered
Mhm.
look like in a
Yep.
dispense versus a high deductible, where for an organization, and this comes back to the finance and the GTN, the curiosity that always kept me going and learning from the other side is the rebates are a trailing indicator, right? Those rebates paid
Mhm.
to the payers are on the back end long after that script is adjudicated. At the same time, when you're a company and you're preparing for a sale, an ex-factory sale, you don't know who's going to get that unit. You don't know what channel they're going to be in. You don't know what healthcare segment they're going to be in, what correlated um, discounts, right? Or rebates. So by the time that comes back to you, it's a trailing indicator. And
Mhm.
all too often you see good, quote, open access at a very high cost on the back end, with a very high out of pocket for a patient that's often bought down on behalf of the manufacturer. And those are not sustainable business models. So
Mhm.
I think it's very important to tie that, bring that rebate perspective early on in the process, and find alternative metrics for how you're viewing your success from an access perspective.
Yeah, no, I think that's really great. And, I think that, one segues nicely into talking a little bit more about data driven optimization and data and insights. But then I also think it raises, a couple of the other, kind of like questions and challenges that, we've been talking about here. One being that incentives across functional teams or focus areas, maybe is a better term, may be slightly different, right? You may have a market access team that is thinking about, that how do I really get to as many formularies as possible, right? To have the broadest percentage of coverage, and they may not be thinking about that from a gross to net standpoint, right? Is this sustainable? Am I able to actually track and measure what this is costing the organization? And am I able to make changes to the way that we're structuring our access program to ensure that it's continuing to drive pull through from a patient standpoint, that they're not dropping off because of, let's say, despite having formulary placement, a really high deductible, but then offer the right solution at the right time for patients. So that's really something that we try to help brands optimize at Phil. Our platform, the PhilRx platform, has end-to-end visibility in the prescription journey because we do everything from wholesale to integrate with the dispense network, support all the benefits investigations as well as prior authorizations. We're able to provide that really granular level of data to brands to start to think about, okay, how do I balance the patient experience with making sure that I'm doing it in a very sustainable way financially so that I can continue to invest in other things that matter as well.
Yeah, and I was just thinking in my head. I remember when benefit investigations and benefit verifications took 24 to 48 hours, right? And just think about the other life on the line, waiting to see what kind of coverage there was going to be. And now, technology has evolved. It could and it should be instantaneous, and it is often, but not all the time. And remember when things were faxed more than they should be, and things went had to be transcreated before OCR helped to translate, and then before there was web forms and applications, and so all this stuff needs to be integrated to provide an optimized HCP experience and a patient experience and manufacturer visibility, right? To be able to track it and change to make sure those best outcomes for the patients are always on the table, because the world's evolving every minute and technology's evolving. So it's just amazing, like you depict here, all of the, assuming this is data from one brand, how you can have such a different outcome based on the payer. And you don't know, the patient doesn't know which payer is in that area. The process doesn't necessarily know that, so you have to find other ways to inform. What does that look like on a regional basis? How does your contracting look like representing in that pharmacy that ultimately would probably get those dispenses?
Yeah, how do you structure the business rules to respond to this? And you know it really shouldn't be, nor do I think many patients would want to have to get this granular, right, to understand how to navigate themselves. Certainly they want to be kept in the loop when it comes to anything that's going on with the benefits investigation and have that transparency of where their prescription's at and the prior authorization process. But the burden really should not be on them to figure out, how can I get my access to my therapy quicker. That should be, I think, falling into the hands of life sciences organizations and partners and other stakeholders that are trying to influence it. So, as we're reaching our last 10 minutes here, I think it may be good to just close out with how brands should be thinking about measuring the success of their access programs. Why don't you start off, Patrick, and then I can talk a little bit about some of the things that we do at Phil to measure the success and look at things that are indicating healthy access outcomes for brands.
Yeah, I think it's asking for it, having the right key performance indicators to say, how do we get a good visibility at a macro level, to changes? How do we structure from a service level agreement to set the expectation of how the business is going to perform, and then be able to measure against it, right? That's really critical. I think a lot of times organizations put this stuff together, have a very good narrative, and then it's not being managed or reviewed on a timely basis, or insights aren't being generated. Some of the more advanced organizations are leveraging AI on top of that data, but you can't leverage AI without the right structure and without the right clean and available information. So I think just things like prior authorization, timing of how many are getting completed in what kind of time frames, in what parts of your network, can be used to inform, are there access, blocks or other insights that need to be generated to help make sure that experience is optimized. Again, leveraging technology. In the real world, all these things take more time and more effort. So the more you can advance the technology and keep the visibility, the better you have the outcome. And so that's just one of those data metrics here that you have listed. But understanding where the coverage is best is really key to determining what kind of efforts that you can deploy and in what locations, because there's unfortunately not unlimited resources for manufacturers to
Right.
deploy full efforts to have optimized education and awareness. It's just that's unfortunately the real world due to all the headwinds that we're facing
Yep.
today. But in a perfect environment, you would have to worry less about that.
Yeah, no, totally agree. I think being strategic and identifying areas that there's opportunity and that will show the biggest return is really critical in the world of more scarce resources from a manufacturer standpoint, and just having to generally do more with less, across the entire life sciences industry. I think we've hit on a lot of these success indicators, throughout our conversation. I think the last thing I'll leave people with is that, and you were touching on this as well, Patrick, just in that you can see tremendous variance from region to region, from an access outcome standpoint. So that's something at Phil that we really prioritize when we're managing a program for a manufacturer, is looking at which regions are high performing, and identifying the metrics to share with our manufacturer partners to show what these regions are doing well, and then also identifying the regions that aren't stellar performers, and identifying that for manufacturers to be able to say, okay, what can I do to improve outcomes in this region? Do I need to have better education about the access program with HCPs? Do I need to have another conversation with the field team to make sure that they understand kind of the key talking points, and their incentives are aligned to be promoting the program that we want to promote? So, with that, we have about 5 minutes left. So, I think we want to open it up for questions to the audience.
Yes, hi. Well, let's go ahead and move on to this Q&A. If you do still have questions, you can submit them using the Q&A tab to the left of your screen. I see we have a lot of great questions already. Let's see what we can get to here today. Starting with, is PhilRx purely a replacement solution for brands, or can it be integrated with existing channel partners?
Yeah, I can definitely take that one. So, we fit into the objectives of the brand. So if the brand is looking to enhance their channel strategy and add another channel partner, we play in that environment. We also play in environments where we are the exclusive hub provider, or even the exclusive channel for brands that have decided to go to market with purely an alternative channel strategy. So we're very much a configurable solution, and work with manufacturers to structure a solution that's going to meet their needs.
Great. For the next question, how can brands measure the impact of their access programs on gross to net?
Yeah, I think that's a great one that I can handle. I think gross to net is a mixture of accounting and forecasting, right? And it's critical that when looking at gross to net, you're first starting with the proper accounting and accrual methodology, which is not so easy to do, but specifically around putting things in the right periods, right? And so you get a current snapshot. And then when you move to the ability to forecast, it's a lot about what are the sources of truth and documentation as the outputs from all of these channels and design to help inform what changes are coming. Is duration of therapy slipping? Is the percentage of business going more to one channel versus another? And if it is, likely the cost of that distribution channel are different. So it's very important to be on top of and integrate these things so the gross to net is being very well connected.
Okay. For the next question, in my experience, HCP adoption has always been a challenge with alternative channels. What's your advice for overcoming this?
Maybe we both
Good,
tag team
Patrick.
this.
Yep.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's for back to if we're looking at an alternate channel strategy, it's how do you give optionality, right? And there's also another question in there about not skewing toward one specific versus another, but you give really good options and you let the real world experience speak for itself. I think that is a great one when you look at saying, we know that if you go through one channel strategy, there's going to be higher availability of data. There's going to be faster time to fill, cheaper costs for a patient. These things are known quantities. I think when you go back into a less defined channel strategy, the opportunity for much more variability is there, and different outcomes that HCPs will have very potentially poor experiences with. Dan, I don't know if that fits with Phil's
Yeah,
perspective. You
no, I
see
mean,
that?
I don't know that I would add too much more. I think the only thing that I would add that we've learned at Phil is that making it really easy for patients to, or excuse me, for HCPs to engage with that preferred channel is a really important thing for brands to be thinking about to ensure that HCPs are going to adopt it. I think one of the challenges when it comes to kind of the traditional hubs, for lack of a better term, that brands are familiar with is that HCPs often are required to fill out really extensive forms and sometimes download new software or engage with new portals. So when that is a requirement and the burden to engage is high, and there's new learnings and things that take an HCP out of their workflow, they typically don't want to do that because they are getting busier, month over month, year over year. So just something for brands to be thinking about when thinking about alternative channel solutions, that they should be making it as easy as possible for HCPs to engage.
Well, thank you both. We are out of time for today. Thank you for attending this Fierce Pharma webinar and for submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank our speakers again for participating and Phil for presenting today's webinar. A recorded version of the webinar will be available for you to access within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you once again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.